Okay, so let's go through the main thing. So my name is Thomas Fong, and I'm the president of the SSA New South Wales branch. On behalf of the branch, thank you everyone for joining us at this branch meeting. And I hope everyone is staying well in the current lockdown, both physically and mentally. And we'll begin the formal part of the event with acknowledgement of the country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, the Statistical Society of Australia acknowledges the traditional custodian of country throughout Australia and the connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Nancy Briggs, and she's the manager and senior statistical consultant at the Central UNSW. She has been a consultant since receiving a PhD in quantitative psychology in 2006, and then spent some time working in Adelaide before moving to her current role in UNSW. And tonight, Nancy will talk about something I'm sure most of us can relate to, when your research meets COVID. And Nancy, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll share my screen here. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Right, okay. This is a subject that I'm returning to. This is my third time speaking on this to different audiences with slightly different focuses each time. Each time I remember, oh yeah, there's a lot more to this than I first thought when I was like, well, what happens? What has happened to us as researchers when we ran into a pandemic about 18 months ago? Obviously, for all of us, it has meant lots and lots of changes. Where we work, probably most of us don't even go into our offices anymore. How we work, literally everything I do is in this tiny little corner of my bedroom, and everything is virtual. Who we work with, we may have moved from a very in-person, interactive working style to everything being remote. And if we are applied researchers, it may have affected how we can do that type of work as well. So just about everything that we do in our work has changed. And of course, there are all the other changes that have gone along with it as well, which makes it much more difficult for even us to do the work at home that we would be able to have done, 2 years ago or so. So just as a sort of funny way, Gordana pointed out when I first got in the meeting that I was not wearing my headgear, and I just wanted to give you a little a view of what I often look like in our team meetings every week. There's my Medusa headband, which is very awesome, but very heavy. So that is a very special occasion for very short periods of time. But I do have my tiara on, even though it's kind of somewhat hard to see in the video here. So what are the impacts on research that the COVID pandemic, the social distancing, all these travel restrictions and things have put on us? And the effects are wide-ranging on just about every aspect of our research. From planning a study all the way through the dissemination of results. It can impact every single step of the way. And in this talk, I'll be focusing on the data collection and data analysis part. The first time I was addressing this topic, I was focusing on research design advice for researchers. We at Stats Central provide, as a core part of our purpose, stats consulting advice to researchers and HTR students at UNSW. And we as consultants had noticed from April or so from last year, we were getting a lot of students in particular coming into us for advice on what am I going to do? I can't collect data. I need to change my study, or I had to stop collecting data. Now what do I do? And so I decided, well, you know what, I think there's something here that we need to address. What happens when something like this, big situation comes along and you can't do what you wanted to do? And so that seminar that I did was focused mainly on what are some ways that you could change your data collection methods, or different study designs in which you didn't have to do in-person data collection, things like that. Then it sort of morphed into a talk to people who help other consultants. It was aimed at other consultants, and things that they can talk to their clients about, and things to think about, as they're sort of helping people figure out what to do with their studies. Now I'm coming back to it again as a person who's actually got to do this. I had a person I've been working with who had a study approved, and they started collecting data more than 2 years ago. In 2019, I believe, they started their data collection. And they just came back to me about 6 weeks ago and said, well, you know, we had the pandemic, so I had to stop data collection. So now I have some data, I don't know what to do with it. And I was like, I have something I can do with it. So that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. So I'm taking that stuff that I talked about to other researchers about, ideas that you could do to address the impact of a pandemic and social distancing and restrictions on our research, to an actual problem that I just got a couple weeks ago. And that study is the PCIT RCT study, and it is an RCT in psychology. Is she's a child clinical psychologist, and she works with children with behavioral problems. And this is an RCT that was designed with 3 arms, relatively small study with 30 people in each arm, comparing the effectiveness of a couple different therapy modalities on parent and child interactions, and then the subsequent behavioral outcomes. And so the standard of care right now for these types of behavioral difficulties is the circle of security method. So that's sort of the active control arm of this study. And she's most interested in whether this parent-child interaction therapy modality is effective and better than the circle of security parenting. And then also they had a waitlist control group as well that got either of the 2 therapy modalities after a waiting period. It was a longitudinal design, relatively basic. They had a baseline measure, an immediately post-therapy, which is an 8-week intervention for both of the 2 modalities. So immediately at 8 weeks, and then 4 months after that, follow-up of those behavioral measures in the 2 therapy intervention arms. And the outcomes that they measured were a mix of survey scales, so validated scales, usually completed by the parent. And those things were positive and negative parenting, measures of stress and parenting sensitivity, also parental reporting of child behavior, and also some home visit scales that require coding by observers. So I think they would do some video capture of the interactions. Like they would present to the child a novel situation or some frustration, a slightly frustrating situation, and then record the parent and child behaviors and interactions then. So it was a combination of those survey and the sort of those practical video coding outcomes. And this was sort of their flow chart. They recruited 90 parent-child units. These were all referred by health professionals. So these kids have some pretty significant behavior difficulties, and they're all very young. I believe that they start eligibility at about 14 months. And they were up to about 4 years old. So they're very young children. And so they're already getting referred for behavioral difficulties. These families are in crisis. So they recruited 90 of them, randomized them, and got their baseline measurements on these outcomes. Delivered the interventions to the 2 intervention arms, which lasted 8 weeks, as I had mentioned. Did the immediate post-assessment or 8-week assessment, and then a 4-month follow-up later on. So, of course, in a design like this, we often expect there to be some missing data. So, of course, our proposed analyses would sort of, expect that. So the analyses were linear and generalized linear mixed models. Most of those outcomes are considered continuous and normal, but there are a couple of binary outcomes that are repeated measured. So generalized linear mixed models were proposed for those. Planned comparisons for particular outcomes, most specifically comparing the PCIT versus the other 2 conditions at that 8-week follow-up. And then they had some ideas about whether or not the treatment was maintained, if there was any effect after treatment. So they want to test those particular hypotheses in the linear and generalized linear mixed models context. And they did the typical things like defining what the intention to treat principle is, and saying what their their primary and secondary outcomes are, and all those kinds of things. In actuality, data collection was stopped before all participants were able to complete treatments and measures. So that means that missing data in this study is a combination of attrition that we would have expected anyway, plus the fact that COVID came in and restrictions meant that there was no more therapy and no more in-person assessments. Okay, so just like this chocolate bar, it's incomplete. When I first started to think about the very first talk that I gave on this, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be, it's just easy. All you have to do is do your linear mixed model, maybe use an indicator variable for whether or not it's COVID missing this, and yeah, you're fine. But luckily for everybody, there are people who think use a bit more than 5 minutes to come up with some analysis strategies, and they publish their recommendations. And this happened really quite quickly after the pandemic had its effects. I think this article was published online in May of last year, when we shut down in mid-March. So they were on top of it, and did a lot of thinking very deeply, very quickly. So the big thing that I'm focusing on in this talk is that missing data that occurred because we have to stop data collection a problem? Or is the pandemic, as it affects research in general and causes missing data or disruptions or changes in data collection strategies, is it really a problem? And it turns out it may be, but also it may not be. And so what you or me, as a person who does data analysis of real data that has been affected in some way by this pandemic, we need to actually step back and start again, just to make sure that everything that we had assumed 2 or 3 years ago, when we were consulted in helping to come up with our proposed analyses and research design, if all of those assumptions still hold, and if they don't, we need to address that and make the right adjustments, understandable adjustments for the situation that we are in now. So, so what are these considerations? Well, obviously, we have a specific big disruption that we need to consider, and it can sort of make these decisions a little bit more difficult and considerable. Data missing or observed can be treated differently in our analyses, depending on, and this is a very fundamental question. So any of you who are going to be looking at data for a study that has been collected in the last 18 months or so, this might be something that that you should think about. Are you going to estimate your treatment or do your analysis in a world with a pandemic, or do you want to do it considering a world without a pandemic? Now, that sounds kind of weird because we are in a world with a pandemic, but a lot of this research was conceived and data collected, and all these things were conceived in a world where this was not an issue. And so that world without a pandemic is where a lot of this stuff was born. So we can't simply ignore that. It's also dependent on whether participants are directly affected by COVID-19, either by infection itself or by changes in treatment. And this changes in treatment thing is a big thing because it doesn't have to have anything directly to do with COVID itself. Like the 2 interventions in this study are in-person therapy sessions. One of them is, I think, completely with another with a therapist observing all 8 weeks, and the other starts out in a group setting and then has a couple individual sessions. So, not in neither of those two situations would those treatment modalities be allowed to happen right now in the type of situation that we're experiencing right now in Sydney, in New South Wales, and in Victoria. Just because the treatment itself is not affected by the pandemic or the virus itself, but the treatment cannot happen in the way that it's meant to because of the restrictions that we're under. Also, whether the missing data or that loss to follow-up and longitudinal studies occurred prior to the pandemic. So if you started collecting data, a couple years before, so you've got some people who could have finished their full longitudinal course before the pandemic, but missed out or decided to drop out or lost to follow-up for some reason or other before it even happened. That can change how that type of data is treated relative to those whose longitudinal data is missing because of the changes due to COVID. Now, Carl and I'll recommend a sort of 4-step process to relook at your study before you actually do the analysis, to reframe and reconsider what you are going to do as a person who's analyzing data that's been affected this way. The first step is clarify your treatment estimate with respect to the occurrence of the pandemic. Then you have to figure out what actually is missing data for after you've defined what your treatment estimate is. And then you actually do your analysis based on the results of the first 2 steps. And then step 4, you might want to do some sensitivity analyses. And so if you actually look at these are all things that you would have done anyway at the very beginning of your study. But now we just have a sort of go back and reconsider and see if we need to make any adjustments here. And which is probably a really good practice anyway, when you're going to do some analyses on RCT data, or if you've got some other data from another type of study, probably a really good idea to go back and make sure the research plan that you may have written years ago is still an appropriate one for what you have. And they helpfully provided this huge flowchart, and obviously you can't really read it, but I encourage you to check out the article if you want to see exactly what they're saying here. But this is sort of, do you answer pandemic-free world versus world including a pandemic, and then sort of the different possibilities that happen once you're stepping through those the steps of those reconsiderations. So step one. So for my study, I'm going to sort of go through what I have done in the last few weeks to reconsider what we want to do. Does the pandemic affect the study estimate? So my first thing I need to figure out is, do I want to estimate my treatment effect in a world with a pandemic or a world without a pandemic? And this is the world without a pandemic. You guys remember when you saw that many people together? It's been a while. Or do I want to, oh wait, that's the world without a pandemic. There's the world with a pandemic. So in which world do I want to sort of place my study? Okay, so how do I go about making that decision? And there are some things we need to consider. So first of all, sort of a practical one. To what degree did my trial overlap with the pandemic? As I mentioned, they had started data collection a couple of years ago. And while it's a relatively small study, it does take a while to find, get the referred kids and get the interventions going. So they were toward the end of their study when they had to cease data collection. So there actually isn't a lot of overlap, but as you'll see in a few slides, there is some, and it's not something that we could just ignore. I mean, if you at the very end of your study and you ended up having to cease data collection, and that really only affected 2 people, if you've got a even a smaller study of 20 or 30 people, is that substantial enough for you to really change a lot of your assumptions, or do some very complex analyses in terms of your missing data assumptions? I don't know. But if you do have a decent degree of overlap, this is something to consider. It also depends on the severity of the pandemic during overlap period. Maybe if this were a study that were being conducted in South Australia or Tasmania, even though we are having all of these difficulties and shutdowns and things, maybe it's not so, the restrictions are not so bad elsewhere. So even though they might be having to slow down data collection, they might not have had to cease altogether. So sometimes it really depends on the types of contact the research has with the study itself, or with the pandemic itself. But it does not depend on whether the treatments or outcomes are directly impacted by COVID. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a factor of whether somebody actually contracts COVID. It could be an indirect effect on the study itself. 2 other people have also commented on how to treat RCT data. Most of these are focused on RCTs in the health and medical sciences. But they really it's really much more general than just those substantive areas. And they recommend choosing a pandemic-free estimate. And for those studies, you know, when they were writing their papers in early to mid 2020, studies that were already going were very much planned before the pandemic actually even happened. So that is what those studies were established to do. I don't know if that's the case now. A year later, there may be lots of studies that have conceived and approved in terms of ethics and things like that. Since then, like, you know, with the pandemic as sort of a thing that's out there, but a lot of studies are conceived without any regard to the fact that we may have these huge impacts and social consequences that affect our research. So for the that practical reason, and the fact that most of the data collection had occurred in the pandemic-free world, I'm choosing to consider the PCIT study in the pandemic-free world. So I'm going to operate in that environment. So before the pandemic, I would have done, you know, those 4 steps. Maybe I wouldn't have, actually said step 1. But I would have gone through the same things anyway. So we would define a study objective, you know, state our research question, and then define your estimate. The estimate is sort of a sort of cluster of things to define. So what you have to define your population. If you're doing an RCT, what are your treatments? What variables and are you going to measure, and how are you going to measure them? So if you're using scales or, you know, those types of things. And then what's your population summary of your treatment effect? And then you should also have some idea of what you're going to do to handle intercurrent, that's post-randomization events. So often statistical analysis protocols or the study protocols will have some idea about we will stop treatment if this happens, or we will end the study if these things happen. So those are all sort of things that happen after randomization, and there's usually some, you know, treatment of that in your protocol. But you don't often, before last year, you might not have put in so there, if a global pandemic makes it so that we cannot collect data, this is what we're going to do. So for the PCIT study, the study objective was, you know, examine the effect of PCIT on parental and child behavior outcomes, particularly relative to standard of care or waitlist control. And we're going to be looking at children with behavior difficulties and their parents, their interactions, and who are referred by a health professional. And these are young children. We have 3 treatments, and we're going to be looking at parental capacity outcomes and child behavior outcomes measured by such and such scales. And we'll be looking at treatment differences at 8 weeks, and then also assessing whether those changes are maintained 4 months later. And the intercurrent events that happened, well, oh my gosh, PCIT researchers stopped data collection in March 2020, and they did not collect any data after that time. They literally just stopped and did not try to follow up on other people or restart the trial again. So that intercurrent events thing is the only thing that really changed in that reconsideration of our estimate. So now I can move on to step 2, which data are missing. Now you would think that this is a very simple question, but it actually isn't. in a world including a pandemic. So if you were in that sort of section of that big flow chart, you don't really have any reconsideration to do. You would just use everything that you have. Every data point that you were able to get is eligible because some of it happened in a pandemic. So let's see what happens here. But I'm in the pandemic-free world, so I need to do a little bit more thinking here. In a pandemic-free world, only data that is unaffected by intercurrent events, or that event that happened, that I identified, is considered. So that would be any data that's collected before or after the pandemic, but we're still in the middle of the pandemic, so that can't happen yet. So any data collected before the pandemic hit is okay to be considered a valid data point. If the trial people had collected more data, last year between July and September, because I'm working in pandemic-free world, I might not want to use those data because we're sort of still in the middle of dealing with COVID and its effects. So data collected during the pandemic, but which is not impacted by a pandemic-related infection, could be used, but maybe not. So you really need to think about if you are assuming a pandemic-free world and you collected data during the pandemic, should you actually be using those data points? And luckily for me, I don't have to think too hard here because they actually just stopped collecting any data at all. So the missing data after data collection ceased, that's all missing, and I don't have to consider any of was this really affected or not affected by pandemic-related events. If you are in a pandemic-free world, those decisions are can be outcome specific. So within a particular study, you might have some outcomes that are not affected by the pandemic, and so you could use them, or you might have some that are affected by the pandemic, and so you would consider them missing, even though you actually observed them. So practically, what does this mean for my PCIT data? Which data are missing? It is just from the research design and what we are studying. There's a reasonable assumption that there are no variables in the PCIT study that are directly impacted by COVID-related infection, although the treatments were. But since they had just decided to stop it, we didn't have to really go beyond, after such and such a date, it is missing, and we don't have to decide whether or not we're going to include those data points or not. But we do have some missing data in our three groups. So 8 people out of 30 in the treatment group that we're most interested in had at least one measurement sometime in their 3 measurement process that was disrupted by ceasing data collection. Only 2 people in the other intervention group were affected, and 3 people in the waitlist group were affected. And you can see that obviously for the follow-up observations, that was sort of the most affected, which makes sense. But like I said, not all data are due to missing data or due to ceasing data collection. In fact, the vast majority of missing data is not due to the pandemic. It's actually attrition, which they sort of expected. The attrition is as you can see here, is actually pretty substantial. So these are the valid observations for just a couple of the outcomes. The child behavior checklist is one of those survey instruments, and the emotional regulation task was one of the observation and head coding outcomes. And I had expected that the observation and coding outcomes would show much more attrition or bigger effect because it's a lot more labor intensive. But it turns out that the missing data patterns for both types of outcomes are about the same. But you can see that by that 4-month follow-up, we're down to at most about 50% people providing valid observations. And in this COSP group, it's tiny. We only had 5 valid observations or 4 valid observations out of 30. So it's obviously attrition is a much bigger problem than the fact that they had to stop data collection last March. Okay, so I have defined what my missing data was based on the fact that I'm looking to analyze my data in a pandemic-free world. Now I need to define my new analysis strategy if it needs to change at all. Just like you would have done before, you detail any changes to your original analysis plan, paying a lot of attention to how you handle missing data. And if you hadn't chosen or proposed an analysis strategy that was amenable to including missing data, now is the time for you to go, I really need to rethink that. And think about the missing data mechanisms and what is appropriate for this data. So of course, the ones that we are always so concerned with when we're doing our data analysis are the missing completely at random versus missing at random versus missing not at random assumptions. Luckily, even for pandemic related missingness, we can probably assume that the data are still missing at random. We know what happened for some of those data points, and so we can actually use that dummy variable that I talked about a little while ago to indicate what type of missingness it is. And then we also probably have some other observed variables that we can condition on as well. And so when we do that, we're probably getting really close to conditioning on those variables, and then we can say that there is a relationship between values and the things we didn't see. I'm probably pretty okay with a missing at random assumption, which means that I have to continue with my linear mixed models or generalized linear mixed models assumptions for my primary analyses. So that's really great. But of course, I can't rule out missing not at random completely. So just like I would when doing any other analyses for an RCT like that, I do have to address the fact that I don't really know if it's not missing not at random. But so maybe I have to, do some sort of analysis addressing that as well. So Crow et al. Recommend doing these types of tests and examinations of your missingness and sensitivity analyses. So defining some, when you are looking at your missing data models, perhaps doing some pattern mixture models with different assumptions for the missingness and unobserved values, just like you would if you were analyzing data without having to consider any of this pandemic stuff. I haven't actually done this yet because, like I said, I just got these data about 5 weeks ago, and definitely have not gotten to this point yet. So I haven't gone back to the researchers to consider very carefully about what types of assumptions should go into these types of analyses. But the good thing for me is it actually is going to be almost exactly what I would have done anyway. I don't have to change anything for this particular study. Meyer et al., one of the other articles that specifically addressed this, has really good discussion about sensitivity analysis considerations. And the flowchart from the Crow et al. Article has some decent suggestions in it as well. And you will notice in that most of their, almost maybe all of them, of the missing not at random discussion is in the situation where you're considering the world with the pandemic. So if you are interested in see what types of things you should be thinking about when analyzing your data, go ahead and take a look at those two articles for some good discussion. So overall, what these articles recommend doing for your actual data analysis and treatment of your missing data are some things that you would normally do, but now you just have to go a little farther and say, yeah, we have this pandemic thing. So, and how do we observe it acting on our data? So obviously, you have to be very open about the fact that that it did affect. So either it affected us by stopping our data collection, or maybe you had to switch to maybe doing phone calls to collect data if you're doing in-person surveys, like some of the survey collection in our study was all in person. So they could have moved to phone data collection, but they just decided to stop the study. But if you did make that type of change, obviously it should be very clear that that type of modality of data collection changed and how many people it affected. So you need to be clear about how much of your data is missing because of these decisions that you had made due to social distancing or restrictions on travel and things like that. And also looking at your study characteristics before and after pandemic onset. If you're still recruiting people after this intercurrent event happens, you need to look carefully at the types of people you have recruited before and after this thing happened. And do you need to include additional auxiliary variables, interaction effects, time varying massages, covariates in your analysis methods? That's what I had focused on when I was like, oh, all you have to do is do a binary variable that includes your is this a pandemic missingness, or did this happen before or after? That's what I came up with after 5 minutes of thinking about it. But obviously there's a lot more that you need to consider when we are actually doing our analyses. And then finally, if the pandemic actions affected decent proportion of your sample, then maybe you want to look at some subgroup analyses too. Perhaps looking at the stuff that happened before and after the pandemic restrictions were enacted, or for particular subgroups, if you had to change your data collection modalities or treatment modalities. So thank you very much. I hope this is giving you something to think about for upcoming analysis of data. I appreciate asking me to speak, and I also appreciate the research team for allowing me to talk about their research study. Also, I thank the Stat Central team for tolerating my headwear, and then also telling me when I'm coming up with very silly ideas. Appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for a wonderful talk. It seems like a rabbit hole in terms of research topic once you start considering the impact of COVID. There's just so many things you have to worry about. It was,
I was surprised at oh gosh, yeah, I guess you do have to think about that. Oh, I guess you have to think about that too. Yeah, so, and right now it's a relatively timely subject for us, I think.
Okay, so there seems to be questions in the chat. is actually very long. Let's see. So essentially, the idea is to treat the problem as missing data problem. There is two types of missing data: those who chose not to respond, and those who are willing to respond but could not because of COVID. So when one makes assumptions about missingness leading to non-response adjustment, and if missingness from COVID is missing not at random, how does one need to make allowance to both types of missingness in the analysis? Do we need to?
Yeah. Maybe one of the ways that you can do analysis that includes missing and not at random assumptions is sort of model the probability of it being missing just at random versus due to something that you haven't measured. That is one way to do it. Another thing that those authors encourage you to do is to avoid this. Contact your subjects and find out why they missed out. So if they didn't come back because they couldn't travel because of the pandemic, then you go, okay, well, it's pandemic related missingness. We know what it is, versus people who didn't come back and you have no nebulous reason where you have to make assumptions on why it is. So there they try to encourage people to do the practical thing and try to get a reason. And that way you can avoid having to do that type of modeling.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and just ask Nancy directly.
So Nancy, I just had a random idea. I was just wondering, you know how like ABS sometimes when people don't respond to their surveys, they chase a couple up, then they try and incorporate that any bias they find in those into their results. Yeah, do you think like that type of method could apply here?
I think absolutely. If you have the resources to do that, I think it is sort of a resource intensive thing, and the ABS probably has the resources to do it. That would be really great. And it gives you much more information which to play with. I think that a lot of people who are getting their RCT data probably don't have that. They don't have the time. They don't have the money. And they probably don't want to annoy the participants. Particularly this study in particular, these parents are very stressed. Obviously, they have some very difficult children, and one of the things that happens is they get frustrated very easily. So I'm pretty sure they wouldn't even want to go back to them and ask them more questions. So it's really very specific to the people you're studying and whether or not you even have the resources to be able to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anyone want to ask a question? Okay. Looks like that's it. All right, so if no one wants to ask any more questions, then I will just close this branch meeting. And please join us, and thank you, Nancy, for wonderful talk about missing data and also COVID in a sense.
Thank you for having me.